Hello, welcome to the Ruby on Rails crash course sponsored by Lambda School. I am Ryan Holdaway, and I will be your guide for this journey into Rails. So I'd like to start out and just talk a little bit about Lambda School, what Lambda School is. Since you're all here, you've probably come across us someplace on the internet. Lambda School is a full-time computer science academy that is online and fully remote. So students can attend our classes from anywhere, receive live instruction, and we train them to be software engineers. Right now we have a couple of programs that we teach. We teach a full stack web program. We teach native iOS development. We teach a data science program, and this fall we're launching UX design and native Android development. So if you'd like more information about any of those programs, you can check out lambdaschool.com. We also teach, in addition to our full-time course offerings, we teach introductory courses for all of those subjects that run for 2 weeks in the evenings. If you want to come have a taste of what Lambda School is like, or have an introduction to any of those subjects, you can get information about that on our website. That's Lambda School. So my name is Ryan Holdaway. I work on the outcomes team here at Lambda School. I'm not an instructor, but yesterday I was having a conversation with our CEO, Austin Allred, and we had a company approach us and ask to hire some students, and they were asking specifically for somebody that had experience with Rails. Now, Rails is not part of the curriculum for our full stack web program. I know that might seem like a huge oversight, but it's a 6-month program. There's only so much we can cover in that amount of time. So we teach a lot of different web technologies. Rails is not one of them, but I was boasting to Austin, I know Rails pretty well, that I could teach a Lambda School graduate enough Rails to take a job working in Rails and be able to contribute to a team immediately, and that I could do that in an afternoon. So he invited me to prove it and tweeted about this course. So that is where this idea came from. Here we are. The goal of this course would be to take somebody who has experience with another web framework, show them how Rails works, how a Rails application is set up, and give them enough, understanding that they could go sit down at a Rails project and contribute. So if you're brand new to programming, this might go over your head. If you're really great at Rails, I don't know why you would be here. But if you're somebody who maybe knows Node or Django or .NET or Java and Spring, any other MVC web framework, this will hopefully be insightful. So that's our agenda for this meeting. I'm going to go over Rails really quick, talk about some of the cool things that Rails does, some of the little unexpected tricks that it has hiding, and hopefully give you enough experience that you could sit down and contribute to a Rails project on your own. So I'm going to start by just diving into a Rails application. We're going to go over the structure of it. We're going to talk about the history of Rails. This will be really high level, going over where to put your code and how to organize it, and then we'll do some live coding, which is always fun. And then towards the end, we will hopefully have some time to take some questions. So I've got some Lambda School alumni and staff here that are going to be helping me moderate those questions. So if you want to use the YouTube chat to jump in, Thomas, if you'll just ping me on Slack if there's a good question, I'll go ahead and take it. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to start with, like all good coding demos, we're going to open a history book and talk about what Rails is and how it got started. So Rails is an MVC web framework for the Ruby language. Now, Ruby is a pretty interesting programming language. It's got a great story. Ruby was created by a Japanese gentleman named Yukihiro Matsumoto, affectionately known in the Ruby community as Mats. And the legend goes that Mats was a C programmer for a long time. And when working with C, he realized that there are a lot of things about the C programming language that are optimized to make machines happy. Static typing, explicit memory management, a compiler, and all of those things work together to make C like a very fast and performant language running on a machine, but it's not super friendly to pick up. And he wanted to work with the programming languages with a programming language that was optimized for developer happiness. So that's how he approached, I guess, the mission of creating Ruby. So Ruby as a programming language is optimized for exactly that. It's optimized for developer efficiency over machine efficiency. So it's got very friendly syntax. It reads a lot like English. It's very flexible. Ruby uses duck typing. There's a lot of type inference. So you can write really flexible code, do really clever things, metaprogramming, and generally pick it up pretty quickly, especially if you have experience with another programming language. A lot of the basic operations are just built in and really nice and slick out of the box. So Ruby is a really elegant language. It was my first programming language, and I really enjoy writing it, even having worked in other ecosystems. It's really flexible and elegant, and I like it a lot. There are a couple of things you should know about Ruby before you get going writing Rails. The main Ruby interpreter is MRI. Now, that's kind of like the default out-of-the-box Ruby, and it is C-based. So in the early days, it was kind of a popular thing to incorporate C packages into your Ruby code, and using MRI, you could just import and have access to like C classes and functions. Lately, as Ruby evolved and got more popular, people started writing additional interpreters for it. So now there's I would say really popular, the most popular other than MRI is called JRuby, and that runs on the JVM. And the promise of JRuby is to perform a little bit better. JRuby guys love to brag about how much faster it is than MRI Ruby. Also to add some increased support for things like multi-threaded processing. You won't find a lot of Ruby shops using anything other than MRI or JRuby in production. And if you do, those kind of places they're kind of like people who do the keto diet or CrossFit or use Emacs. They will let you know. But really, you should just know a little bit of the couple of differences between MRI and JRuby if you're going to take a Ruby job. And then if you get directed anywhere outside of those two, they'll tell you about it, and they'll tell you usually why they made that decision. So Ruby was created in the 90s by a guy named Mats. The community that developed around Ruby as a programming language, I think, is pretty unique, especially for internet communities, but even more for programming language communities. Matt's vision for Ruby was a programming language that developers would be happy when they were writing. And he has a reputation for being a really nice guy. He open sourced Ruby from the start. He's been very collaborative and working with organizations and contributors to develop and build out Ruby, and he's done, I mean, countless hours of work for free on it. So the motto of the Ruby community kind of stems from that, and it is a phrase called Mina Swan. So that's an acronym, MINASWAN, and that stands for Mats is nice, and so we are nice. So in the Ruby community, you will find that it's very open to beginners and people who are just starting out. That's one of the reasons I think that Rails is such a popular web framework, is a lot of people have gotten their first taste of web development by using Rails, and people who are more recently breaking into the field tend to be, you know, a little bit more aware of what that struggle is like, and they try to pay it forward. So I think when you're comparing like different languages or frameworks to learn, you know, using online resources, you'll find that there's volumes and volumes of material about how to learn Ruby. People have donated tons of time to develop those and build those out. And that's very much because of Mats and what a great guy he is, and what a great example he sets for the rest of the Ruby community. So you'll very rarely find Ruby people online that are going to be mean. That's a pretty open and welcoming community and very friendly, especially for beginners. And for that reason, I think it's a great place to start early on in your career. Not only is it a powerful tool, but there's a lot of information about how to use it freely available online. And then there's also a lot of people who are just waiting and willing to help you as you're starting out. So it's kind of my sales pitch for why Ruby is a good place to start. And I still believe that Rails, you know, it's a pretty mature framework by now. It's first released in 2004. So, I mean, that makes it a dinosaur in the online community, especially compared to some of the JavaScript frameworks that are popping up so frequently and so transient. But I still believe that even after all these years, Rails is the fastest way to spin up a CRUD app and get it into production. There's done a great job of abstracting a lot of, you know, complicated, difficult things away, and you can sit down and just write code and have it shipped in a hurry. So I want to talk a little bit about Rails and like the history of Rails and where it came from. So like I said, Rails was created in 2004. It was released in 2004. They've been working on it for a while by David Heinemeier Hansen, DHH on the internet, and the team at Basecamp. Now, I think it's really important to understand that history about Rails before you sit down and start writing it, because if there was one word that people could use to describe the Basecamp team and DHH specifically, it would probably be opinionated. And Rails is a very opinionated framework. The Rails framework really strongly favors convention over configuration. And by that, I mean Rails has a really clear way of doing things. And if you're going to sit down on a Rails project, you should do it the Rails way, or you'll have a hard time, because you know, the metaphor of Ruby on Rails, like it's like Rails for a train. Like they're designed to keep the train moving in the right direction and to keep it safe and moving quickly and efficiently. And that's very much what Rails is. So if you're on the path, if you're on the tracks, if you're sticking to the Rails way, Rails is a very powerful tool. If you want to break free from that, you're going to be fighting the framework a lot. So I think a lot of that was intentional design by DHH and the team at Basecamp as they were first building it, and they've really kept to that quite a bit over the last 15 years that Rails has been a thing. At this point, I'm going to just check the chat real quick to make sure that there's not any interesting questions, and then we will jump in and talk about MVC. Somebody asked if Rails was still relevant. The answer to that is a resounding yes. Have Lambda students made Ruby on Rails apps as part of their capstones? Not yet, but man, I'm really hoping that with a resource like this, some Lambda School student will be brave enough to try. But most of the capstone projects at Lambda School so far have been MERN stack or Django on the back end. Yeah, Ben Eggett in the chat. Man, shout out to Ben Eggett, is the man who taught me Rails. So thanks for coming, Ben. Good to see you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about MVC architecture and what that is and why it's important and why we need to think or know about it. So MVC stands for Model, View, and Controller. There are other MVC frameworks. MVC is not a new idea. First web applications being architected using this idea, I mean, this goes all the way back to Smalltalk in the 80s. It's designed to give developers like a real clear separation of concerns, to have different components that are responsible for like one thing and be very good at it and not bleed out into other things. So models, views, and controllers all have separate responsibilities. Let's go through them one at a time and kind of talk about what those responsibilities are. So models are responsible for data and logic and rules. So the model will be the part of your application that interacts with your database to, set up a structure, to validate your data, any kind of, rules around what your data needs to be, look like, act like. That lives in a model. And a model is the only thing in your application that touches a database. So in Rails, that's pretty clear. Rails has an ORM built in called ActiveRecord, and ActiveRecord lives in your model. So data stuff, model. A view is kind of an obvious one. A view is your presentation layer. That takes data and packages up and presents it for a user. Now, in the context of a full stack Rails application, a view is going to include some HTML code. It's going to include some CSS, and it basically just gets handed some data and presents it in a nice, pleasing way that users can see and interact with a little bit. And that interaction is where the controller comes in. So controllers are responsible for collecting and packaging data and allowing users to interact with it. So that is where you'll go from a view to a model. The controller sits in between and makes sure that the views get everything that they need and that the models are building those packages and setting them up. And a controller is also where, through a user interface or an API call, data will be updated or modified in some way. So that's your model, view, controller at a high level. There's really two main ways to use Rails in the context of building web applications. The first is this idea of a full stack Rails application, which is where you'll have like a database. Then you'll have your Rails models will interact with the database and collect and package your data. You'll use Rails as a controller to reach in, to get data and package it, and then hand it to a view. And then you'll also use Rails to generate your HTML views and to serve those on a website somewhere. So somebody goes to www.myrailsapp.com. They'll see HTML that's been rendered on your server by your Rails app, and be able to interact with it. You'll use Rails to generate those views and those pages. It's also becoming more common these days as user interfaces have more requirements around speed and responsiveness, to use something like React as a front end for a Rails app. And in that case, you would build your API in Rails, and you would use React to generate and render HTML in the client, and your Rails app view layer would become like API calls, and it would be building JSON packages to hand off to your React app. So we're going to cover both of those later as we get into a Rails app, and I'll even show you how to build a hybrid. So both. I also am going to drop in some more resources towards the end. Well, probably at the end, in case anybody sees this and wants to dive deeper into Rails and pick it up on their own. I've curated a list of a couple of places where I think you can go to get additional information. So now as we get into this Rails app, I want to just kind of go over how this is going to go. I'm not going to get too hung up on easily Googleable information. So I'm not going to spend the time like going over the syntax of Ruby or like what, you know, all of the objects can do. I mainly just want to talk about the structure of a Rails app to give you the context that is kind of hard to pick up until you've had experience working in a framework. And I'll leave out most of the easily Googleable information. Like I'm not going to give you this exact syntax for everything. I'll just kind of talk about the ideas. So it's going to be very high level of what a Rails app can do. And then, you know, hopefully you'll be able to sit down and know where to look for things if you're modifying somebody else's code, know where to put things if you're writing your own code. And then I'll also turn you loose with a couple of good resources where you can go to find if you need help with like specific syntax things. That's the cool thing about Ruby is it's really easy to read. So a lot of what we go over will be should be pretty clear what's going on, and I'll explain it as we do. So with that, I'm ready to just pop open a Rails app and start taking a look at it. Does that sound good to everybody? Let me share a link to this code in the chat. Should I drop it in the chat? Will the chat stick around? Should I drop it in the comments? Let me just add it. I'm going to add it in the comments if you're looking for the code. I'll add it in the comments and I'll add it in the chat, so everybody should be able to find it. Boom. Okay, so yesterday I found somebody else's Ruby and Rails repo. Chat will stick around. Great. Okay. Well, we've got a redundant link. So that's not the end of the world. I'm just trying to say I went and I stole this code that somebody had a repo of a beginner Rails blog. You can see it attributed in the description on the GitHub repo. I wanted to sit down on some code that I didn't write, and I'm not going to like go through step by step and write all this. I just kind of wanted to go over what's already there and kind of give like how I would sit down at a Rails app that I'm unfamiliar with and start poking around. And also I'm going to explain all the different files and like where they go and what they do. So there's two main types of files, extensions in a Ruby app, in a Rails app. There's .rb files, which are pure Ruby files, and then there's .erb files, which the E stands for embedded. So ERB files are embedded Ruby files. So an ERB file is most often a view file where you can have a bunch of HTML, and then if you have parts of your web page that you would like to be dynamic and either conditionally render or use some kind of data coming out of your database to be dynamic in any way, you can just embed Ruby code right in your view to do that. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go take a look at some code and I'll walk you through what all those files look like. So let's take a look. So I just have a pretty basic development environment set up, and I've got Sublime Text and just iTerm running, which is really all you need to have to write Rails. You need a text editor and you need a terminal, and that's about it. Oh, and a web browser. That's helpful too. So Safari is my web browser. Sublime Text, the free version, is my text editor here. And then I'm using iTerm too. So we'll jump over to a terminal in a minute. But like, let's take a look at different kind of Ruby files and what they each look like. So I'm going to do a regular RB file first. And I'll kind of start there. Whoops. Let me find a bigger one. Okay. So this application is just a web blog. You've all seen web blogs before. You've got articles, posts, comments, you know, the basics of a blog engine, and that's what this has. So Ruby is a very, very object-oriented language, which means that everything in Ruby is an object, and you use objects to operate. Objects can contain regular data attributes, something that's read directly out of a database. They can contain virtual data attributes if you have some way of calculating what a value is, and they can also contain methods that are built in. But a basic Ruby file is a class file, like a lot of object-oriented stuff. You define a class like this, camel case with the first letter being capitalized and then the first letter of every additional word being capitalized. You can use this little caret to signify inheritance. So in this case, our articles controller will inherit from application controller. Application controller is another class here in our controllers folder, and that inherits from action controller base, which is a built-in Rails class. So that's kind of our inheritance tree here and where things are coming from. Can I increase the text size? That's a reasonable request. Thomas Dillard, how's that, bud? I think that's probably good. Okay. So within a Ruby class, there are a couple of different ways you can interact with it. You can define a method just like this, the def keyword method signature, and then that creates a block. You close it with an end. So this is just a basic method definition. If you wanted to take some kind of argument, you would just pass it in with parentheses like that, but index doesn't need it. So a couple of just syntax things going on here. So this little @ sign in front of a variable name is what we call an instance variable, which basically means that an instance from within any instance of this class, once this variable's been defined, you'll have access to it. We use a single equals in Ruby as the assignment operator. So the right-hand side will be assigned to this instance variable. In this case, this right-hand side, this is that interesting ActiveRecord thing I was talking about. And we'll talk about that later. But this is basically a basic Ruby file. You've got methods that get defined. You have some configuration stuff that goes at the top. This is a built-in Rails method for basic authentication. This type of authentication absolutely sucks, and you will never, ever use it in production in a million years. But for the purposes of doing a crash course 2-hour demo, it fits just fine. And in this case, the line is just wrapped. There's a comma here at the end. This could all be one line. But for readability, it's just put on two. So basically what this means is this is a class of callback where on all of these controller methods, it's going to be piped through this method with these arguments, and then with the exception of the index and the show method. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more about callbacks and stuff in a little while. Just want to show like the basic structure here, so you can set up some configuration at the top of the file. You can define methods just like this, really simple def keyword, end keyword, everything in the middle will be invoked when this function is called, when this method is called, sorry. That's an important distinction. And then at the end, Ruby does have support for private methods. Underneath the private keyword, everything for the rest of the file will be private and can only be called from within this class. And that's, in this case, just one method, but you can put as many private methods as you want. So this is a basic Ruby file. It looks like pretty readable. You know, you can come sit down at this and kind of understand what's going on. Now I want to take a look at an embedded Ruby file and talk about that for a minute. So we'll just go to this one. Okay, so an embedded Ruby file, there's like one main difference between this and just a raw HTML file, and that is these ERB tags. So this open angle bracket with a percentage sign being closed by a percentage sign and a closed angle bracket, this tag means that the code in between inside that tag will be evaluated by Ruby. So that's not HTML, that's Ruby, and it's before the file is rendered. It's as it's rendering. So in this case, we just have a simple Ruby if block. So if there's a flash error present, we will render what's between the if and the end, which is basically a span with the error inside it. If there's a notice, if there's a success. Right, so this code will evaluate. Now there's two different types of ERB code, and if you're looking closely at the file, you'll notice that this one is just an angle bracket and a percentage sign, but this one is an angle bracket, a percentage sign, and an equal sign. Now that equal sign is really important because the difference between the regular percentage sign and the one with an equal sign is the equals means that it will be rendered on the page. So the results of this expression are going to be rendered on the page as HTML at the end of this evaluation. And while these are just, they'll just evaluate and not render anything. So that's the difference here. Nobody ever told me that when I was first learning Rails, or maybe they did and I forgot, but it took me a really long time before I picked that up from context, an embarrassing amount of time. But this is what an ERB file looks like. So you'll see you've got all of your regular HTML stuff is valid in here. You can assign classes. You can write CSS directly in here. You know, you can build tables, all of your valid HTML, and then you can mix in some Ruby to get Ruby to write HTML for you. So those are the two types of Ruby files. And then there's a special kind of ERB file that's called a partial. That's a file where the file name starts with an underscore. And what that is just like a reusable chunk of HTML that you can embed within another view. So in this case, this is a form to create a new post. You don't want to write this form a bunch of times and style it a bunch of places. You probably just want to dump the component into other layouts that you have. So you would abstract that with an underscore, and then on my create, I'm just going to render that form. And on my edit, I'm just going to render that form because the create and edit should be the same. So those are two of the different types of Ruby files. So I want to go over real quickly just the structure. Can I make this side bigger? I can't make that bigger. The structure of a Rails app. So here I am inside my project folder. This is just called Holdaway. I have a couple of file folders here that are just nested directories. I want to go over a couple of these and how they work. So a really important type of file in a Rails project is a gem file. Your gem file is where you load external packages. So Ruby packages are called gems. Ruby and gems, you get it? And the Ruby package manager is called bundler. So you will install, when you're setting up your machine, you'll install Ruby. You'll use that to install bundler. And then once you have bundler, you'll use that to install all of your other gems. Now, the source for most of these, rubygems.org, is like where bundler looks by default. You can customize this. If you need to load in a custom version of a gem, you can do it by just pointing at the Git repo. But essentially, this is where you set up all of the packages that you're going to use in your project. So if you have any external dependencies, they will be here. Now, in the Ruby language, a hash mark at the beginning of a line is a comment. I have Sublime set up. This is just out-of-the-box syntax highlighting for a Ruby file. So you'll notice strings are yellow and comments are gray. Keywords are this nice purple magenta color. So like adding an external package is pretty easy. You just add the gem keyword, you add a string with the name of the package, and by default, Bundler will look at Ruby gems, search for this file name, this package name, and then it will install the latest version on your system. If you want to pin to a certain version of an external dependency, which is usually a smart thing to do, you can do that in a couple ways. This is a pessimistic pin. What this means is you will give it a version number, and it will only allow the last digit to update. So in this case, we say we want to pin to Rails 514. If Rails 515 comes out, it'll take Rails 515, Rails 517, it'll take Rails 517, but it will not allow anything beyond that. So it won't go to Rails 5.2. Any version of Rails 5.2. That's what this operator does. You can be more explicit about that. You can say the oldest version I want to accept greater than or equal to 337. You can do the inverse, be like, have it be less than, or you can give it just an explicit equals and get pin it to an exact file name. Now, gem files also allow you to group into different groups. So say there's some packages you just want to have in your development or test environment, something like Selenium WebDriver you probably don't need in production. You can group that just like this. Everything in between the block will only be loaded in that environment, and you can even get specific and give it one environment, or you can give it two, and that doesn't really matter. So that's a gem file. If you ever want to know what gem file versions of specific gems you have on your system, and if you ever want to know, what the cascading dependencies are, so like Rails is a pretty big package and it has a lot of its own dependencies. You can pop open your lock file and you can see exactly, with this nested way that this gets printed out. This file is generated by Bundler when you run a bundle install, and it tells you what version of what packages you have and what dependencies that comes with. So scrolling through this, you can get an idea of exactly where you're at for your different packages. It's a useful thing to look at if you've ever used a package JSON. It looks pretty similar. At the root of your Rails directory, if you're using GitHub and you have a readme.markdown file, that will be displayed in the README section on your Markdown. That's not required. Same thing with the git ignore. That's not required, but sometimes you'll want to ignore certain folders. Log and temp are good examples of that. Starting with, I think, Rails 5. Don't quote me on the exact version. Rails is shipped with Yarn support. You can do that too. So that's like your root directory of your Rails application and where to look for external dependencies right in your gem file. So let's pop open your app folder. This is where most of your code is going to go. You have a couple nested folders. The assets folder is for, you can guess, images. Your JavaScripts can go in here. Your style sheets can go in here. You can use raw CSS. You can use Sass. You can use less. You can use whatever you want for a style sheet. They look pretty. Let's try on syntax highlighting there. I mean, pretty standard CSS. Nothing changes there. It's a Rails convention to keep as much of your styling in your style sheets folder as possible. A lot of projects, when they get set up and architected, and I really like this pattern, is to use a style sheet specific to each controller. So you'll notice here you'll have articles That's a controller that I have. Comments is a controller that I have. And when I'm styling an article page, I'll put those styles in the articles folder, you know, for all my different controllers. They'll have their own style sheet. They also have their own JavaScript. Application.js is usually a dependency loading tree. Rails by default, I guess, still uses CoffeeScript. That kind of surprised me. It might be just this project that's using CoffeeScript. You can use raw JavaScript as well if you want. JavaScript channels. Let's talk about channels. Channels are pretty new to Rails. It's basically just a WebSocket implementation to do like real-time updating of apps. Images, if you wanted to put some logos or any kind of images, you put them in your images folder. That would become part of the asset pipeline, and Rails will compile those before you deploy and add cache busting for free, which is pretty cool. And then you've got a config folder where you can put like a manifest or specify your load dependencies and stuff like that. So assets folder, takeaway, that's where you look for images, JavaScripts, and style sheets. That's probably pretty straightforward. Channels is a folder where you can use application cable. Like I said, it's a WebSocket implementation. If you want to build connections that stay alive, you'll use action cable and sockets for that. Your controllers folder, we kind of talked a little bit about what controllers do already, but basically this is where you'll go to allow your views to access data. They'll go through a controller to build a package. So let's talk more specifically. I already showed you this file, but we'll talk about it again. So basically, this controller has certain methods that are built onto it that will often correlate with a REST verb and a URL. That's how these functions or these methods often get invoked. And basically, they're for packaging up data. So, and stupid Sublime keeps doing that when I hover over something. But in this case, my index method is just building a collection of all of my articles, right? It's for an index page. So it's going to build this variable, all of my articles. When you see a capitalized word in Ruby, that I'm accessing a class. And my article class, I just know this, but I'm going to tell you. Article, a singular word in Ruby is often a model. So that correlates to a data model. Often data models have a database table that they're paired with one-to-one. So I'm accessing this data model, and I'm calling the .all method on it. Now, .all is an ActiveRecord method that basically writes SQL to reach into your database and select every record from the database table that article is correlated to. So in this case, I have a SQLite 3 database. There's a table on there called articles. And this ActiveRecord function method basically generates the SQL to select star from articles and return that. And then I save that out as this variable. So I'm going to talk more about how these pieces play together and how routing works. And we're also going to talk about databases here in a minute. But essentially, I just want you to see here there's different methods in this controller that get invoked most often by some kind of route or interaction that comes through, like an HTTP request is like a really clear example of how that often works. So you'll notice that we don't use RESTful verbs in here. Well, except for this one. That's intentional. So we'll talk more about that when we get to routing, but just know that like these are convention words for actions, and you can kind of like use your imagination and think about like what RESTful verb would go with each of these actions. And we'll talk about that later as something to think about. So outside of controllers, there's also this concerns folder. A lot of times it can be helpful to have methods that you'll want to sprinkle into a bunch of your controllers. You would write that in a concerns file. You would include it in each controller that you wanted to use it, and then that would give you like an inheritance to bring in methods from another class. Concerns is a place to take that. So that's an architecture pattern. Some people use that a lot, some people don't. Helpers, closing our controllers folder and moving on to our helpers folder. Those are very similar. These get included in controllers or models, and they live here. So if you have some code that would apply to all articles, you could write it here in your helpers and then include those in your other classes. And that's just a way to abstract out of your models and controllers things like business logic. So jobs, that is for tasks that you want to have run and be kicked off by something other than an HTTP request is most often. So if you have like scheduled jobs, like if you want to use like a cron tab or something, you could write methods and classes here in the jobs folder, store those, then you could use something like cron to start them up and have them run, say, on a schedule. A lot of examples and use for that. There's none in this application, I don't think, but that's where something like that would go. A mailer. Mailers are special kinds of controllers that have to do with emails, and they have their own special kind of view. So mailers folder is pretty explicit. That's where you go when you want to talk about mailers, emails, and that kind of thing. Models has its own concerns folder as well, and then it sets up your data. So I want to talk a little bit about ActiveRecord while we're here. So ActiveRecord is one of the things about Rails that's described most often as Rails magic. And what I mean by Rails magic is, when you're working in another framework, when you are, sitting down to like write from scratch, a lot of times you have to be like very, very explicit about a lot of things, and accessing your database is one of those. So it's pretty common to just write raw SQL and have that execute from within, another web framework. But Rails has like really tried to abstract all that away and use ActiveRecord as this really powerful ORM. And ActiveRecord is one of the things that probably Rails developers fight about the most. People who come from other ecosystems tend to complain about ActiveRecord. People who start out in Rails and move to another ecosystem tend to complain when there's no ActiveRecord and they're trying to write, other code with an ORM that's not as not as full featured as ActiveRecord. But basically, there are a lot of keywords that you can put into a model definition that will do something magic. So in this case, our article is set up with this has many keywords, and then we can give it this idea that it has many comments and this flag of dependent destroy. And like this one line of code does a lot of really cool things. So the first thing that it'll do is it will tell ActiveRecord that these two tables are connected, the comments table and the articles table, and it will use the foreign key on comments to build an association, so that when you get a hold of an article, you can also really quickly get a hold of all of the comments that belong to that article. This dependent destroy, this is another really powerful thing that you can add to those relationships. That means that when I destroy an article, I get a cascading delete, and it will destroy all of the comments that belong to that article. So really quickly, you can see how this would make like maintaining your database super easy, because I can build a function in my articles controller to delete a post, and it will get a hold of a post. It will call destroy on that post. And then because we have a cascading delete built in for free from ActiveRecord, it'll also cascade and delete all of the associated objects. In this case, it's just comments, but if we had a bunch of tables that were all joined together, you can see how that would be a powerful, useful thing. It's also incredibly dangerous because if you give users a way to delete data, often people will hit the wrong button, but that's like a philosophical discussion that you can have when you're setting up your own project. I just want to mainly highlight one of the super cool things about ActiveRecord is that it makes associations just dead simple and easy. And I'll show you in a console later how this works, but it's pretty cool. ActiveRecord also has great validation just built in. So you can give it, use this validates keyword. You can give it a column or any attribute. And then there's different kind of validators you can pass in. In this case, I'm just checking for the presence of a title and a minimum length. But you can, this is an incredibly powerful validation tool. You can use built-in validators like presence and minimum length, maximum length. Type checking here too. You can do a lot of cool stuff. You can also write your own custom validators. You can have this validate with a custom method that you define later in the class and have it do anything. So if you want to give it like a regex, if you're validating an email address matches a simple format, for example, you can use anything you can code up. You can validate that, and then the article won't be allowed to save either on create or update unless validations pass, which is really powerful to keep your data clean. And that's just built in with Rails ActiveRecord, which is super cool. So that's about it for models at a high level. This is where you set up your data and your structures, and you can add validations, you can add associations. You'll notice that has many here on articles, has many comments. On comment, you set up a belongs to article. Now the has many and the belongs to, those are keywords that they deal with foreign keys. If you're using a relational database, you'll need foreign keys to connect your tables, and the foreign key goes on the thing that belongs to another thing. So comment in this case will hold the foreign key. So that's what a model is. Our views folder, again, you'll have like a views folder for most of your controllers will have their own views, and you'll notice that the names for each of these templates kind of correlate with methods in our controller. What that does is it means that when that controller method gets invoked, it takes this instance variable and passes it here, which is pretty cool. It takes the name of the file and builds that connection. So one thing, again, this is a Rails convention thing. In Rails models, you'll notice these are all singular. Controllers are often, well, they're plural, right? And you can sometimes get into trouble if you use, Rails has generators where you can, say you want a new like data type or thing, you can use a generator to create what they call the scaffold, and it'll create a file for you for your model, it'll create a file for you in your views, it'll create a file for you in your controllers, it'll create tests and like just give you a whole bunch of free files, but it will infer the plural. And what I mean by that is it just adds an S on the end. So in the English language, a lot of times you just add an S to make something plural, but sometimes you don't. So if you have like a model called moose, it'll give you a controller called mooses. If you have like a model called ox, it'll give you a controller called oxes. And you can customize that in an inflections file, and I'll show you where that is. But just be aware that if you're using Rails generators, it's going to automatically just add S's for you, and that can be kind of a hassle if you're not expecting it. So views. The view folders just contain HTML with Ruby embedded into it. And like I said, if you're using Rails as an API, your view layer will just be often just building like JSON packages and setting things up to be a specific format so that when your edit function is invoked through your controller, you will respond with a certain JSON format. You can customize that in a view. But most often you're just going to use it to render HTML. Then you have this thing called layouts. Layouts will allow you to build like a layout that your whole application uses. So if you want to add things like meta tags, if you want to include default style sheets or JavaScripts, you can have like this head section for your HTML where you can customize all that. And then your body tags here are just wrapped in a yield. And what that means is that whatever other HTML you have will just get stuck in here. So a layout for your application is usually where you set up your configuration stuff. You also have layouts that are default for your mailers, both HTML mailers and text mailers. You can't add HTML to a text mailer. So that's it for views, and that's it for the app folder. Let's keep going. So bin folder, this is for configuring things like bundle, Rails, rake. Most often you're just going to leave this as the default settings, but that's where it lives. Your config folder, this is a place that's really important. You've got a lot of Rails magic things happen in this folder. So Rails supports multiple environments by default for free. So it'll give you a test environment, it'll give you a production environment, it'll give you a development environment, each with like different rules that are built in here where you can set configuration settings. You know, you might want to have different caching rules for production than development. Same thing with tests. Like you might want to have configuration available for your different environments. And that's all configured here. You can take a look at this file or these files and set up your different environments. Initializers are for you know, things that get loaded as your application is starting. Again, this is a configuration situation. So if you want to, you know, bust the cache of all your assets, you can just roll this number right here and it'll cache bust all of your assets and force people to re-download them. If you want to, you know, configure how your cookies are serialized, anything else. This is that inflections file I was telling you about. If you do have a model where the plural of just adding an S doesn't make sense, you can customize that here. For example, I worked for an education company for a while, and we used a table called quiz. And I wrestled with getting that support for a really long time before I found out how to use this. So inflection file, I don't really know what a MIME type or wrap parameters file is used for. So just if you don't know what it is, don't touch it. It's a good rule. Locales. Rails has really great support for internationalization. You can set up a locale file. You tag all of your text just like this. And then depending on your environment key, it'll load the string where the tag matches. And this is a YAML file, and you can just nest these as deep as you want and just dot into accessing all of your different translations. And this is like a really powerful way to internationalize an app just in a hurry. And it's really great if you need to support multiple languages. Super easy to set that, super easy to customize it just with the YAML syntax. Additionally, in your config file, again, you've got like an application thing. You can look in here for your different customizations. I do just want to highlight two files real quick. This is your database YAML file. This is a really important file because this sets up your database connections. A lot of times you'll want to connect to a different database, you know, in development than you would in production. This allows you to run your application in a safe mode so that you're not, you know, accessing production data. You can set up, you know, different adapters. ActiveRecord comes by default with a lot of powerful database adapters, but you can literally use Rails with just about any database. A favorite in development is SQLite because it's so easy to set up and use. Postgres is really popular. MySQL is really popular. Rails is designed because of the object-oriented nature of Rails, it plays really well with relational databases, but that's probably where you should start. So I'm not going to even suggest that you use a document database with Rails. Environments, this is if you want to set up different rules for environment loading. Puma is a web server. There are other web servers that work with Rails. Your secrets. It's generally a bad idea to check secrets into version control, and Rails has some support for keeping those actually private, such as this, loading from an env syntax here. But this is a toy app, and it doesn't really matter. So you can put secrets here, API keys and stuff. And then let's talk. I want to come back to the routes file. I'll come back to routes. That's an important one. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Moving on past the config file folder, here's a database folder. There's two really cool files in here. The schema file is this to show you the structure of your database. I want to tell a brief anecdote. At my first Rails job, we did not check this file into version control, even though there's this line here that is automatically generated by Rails that you should check this file into your version control. That caused a lot of problems. Every time you run a migration, Rake will automatically update this timestamp. And I think one of the engineers on our team was just getting frustrated that this was like, there was often merge conflicts and he didn't really know how to use Git. So just put this in the git ignore, and it became a problem because this file is supposed to help you understand the structure of your database. And if it's not kept up to date, it won't do that. But basically this shows me all of the tables and all the columns and any other attributes that my database has. So you'll see my schema contains a table called articles. This force cascade is that thing we were talking about with the cascading delete. That's pretty cool. I've got a couple of columns here that are defined. So I have one with a string type, that's called title. I have one with a text type, that one's called text. And then some timestamp columns as well for comments. Same deal. I've got a string column and a text column, and then this integer of article ID. This is that foreign key I was talking about that helps connect these tables that Rails just gave me for free and did a little bit of Rails magic for me. I've also got my timestamps, and I've got my index added for free too. So schema is not where you go to change the structure of your database. It's where you go to look at the structure of your database. If you want to change the structure of your database, you have this migrations folder. And this is what a Rails migration look like. So when I'm creating a new database table, I will use a migration file to do that. Now this is nice because it gives you history of all the steps your database has gone through. And when you use a Rails generator to create a migration file, it will give you a timestamp at the beginning of the file name. And what that does is it ensures that these files get run in order. And that's really important because if you have tables that depend on each other, you can't reference an article table if the article table doesn't exist. So it'll run them based on the timestamp. That's really important. Now, there's a couple of different ways to set up a Rails migration. Most often, you'll use like an up migration and a down migration. A down migration is run when you want to roll something back. An up migration is if you want to like add something. But a change is basically when you say, I want to do this action on my up, and if I ever need to roll it back, just do the opposite. So Rails is magic and smart enough to know that a create table inside a change block, the inverse of that is a drop table. So when I run this migration going up, it will create a table. If I ever need to roll it back and do it in a down, it will just drop the table. Ruby has this really cool block syntax that, when you're operating on something that's enumerable, you use a do and an end, and then between your pipes, you have whatever you put in here will become a local variable. That's the object that you're at within the collection. So in this case, T just becomes the table that I'm creating. So I'm going to give T a new column type of string with the column name of title. Same thing with text. And this will just loop through and create all of these columns on my database table. Now, timestamps is like, again, one of those built-in Ruby Rails magic methods that you see here. I just call it timestamp, but then in my schema, it gives me 2 date time columns, a created at and an updated at. And ActiveRecord is magic, and if you have a column called created at, it'll update the timestamp when you create the object. And if you have a column called updated at, ActiveRecord will update the timestamp every time it gets updated, which is pretty cool that comes for free, and you don't have to explicitly tell it to update those when you're modifying, creating data. You don't have to manually do that. Just ActiveRecord magic. Rails is cool. So that's the database folder. The lib folder, you can put assets in here. You can put tasks in here. Tasks are things that get run, again, that are not invoked by a controller action. So it's a good place to put like one-off tasks that you want to run, either by calling them manually or attaching them to a scheduler of some kind. That's what you'd use a task for. It's just like arbitrary code to execute that's not started by a user hitting a button in an interface, something like that. A log folder is exactly what you'd expect it to. A node modules folder is like exactly what you would expect it to be. Public folder, again, exactly what you'd expect it to be. You've got some layouts out here for 404 pages, 500 pages. You can put a favicon, robots text, anything you want to be public. Your test folder, again, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect it to be. Rails, again, the Rails way, the configuration, convention over configuration is that you can write your tests connected to the class that they're supposed to be testing. So when you use Rails generators to build a new model, it will create a test file for that model. And whoever wrote this code didn't write any tests, probably because it was just a little demo blog, but this is where you would put tests for your comments, and this is where you would put tests for your article model. If you had controller tests, you put them in here. You can use something like a fixture to set up, demo data if you wanted to access that in your text. You could use a lot of Rails engineers that I know like to use factories. There's external support for using factories, but that is the Rails test folder. Holy cow, this is taking forever. Temp folder. This is where stuff gets cached. You can see, I don't want to keep digging into this, but like you'll see there's like 1 million files in here. You don't ever have to look at or mess with that. Vendor, sometimes you'll include some plugins or external libraries that go in your vendor folder. Okay, I've been talking for like a little over an hour straight. I'm gonna snag a drink real quick. If anybody has any questions, drop them into chat. Let's take like a 30-second, no, let's take like a 2-minute break. And then I'm gonna jump back in and we're gonna write some code. Sound good? Okie dokie. I am back. Thank you for giving me some time to snag a drink. Okay, let's see. I got the YouTube chat open. Doesn't look like anybody had any questions. All right, so let's jump in and keep going. All right, so we talked a little bit about the structure of a Rails app so far. I want to talk a little bit about just like having a development environment for Ruby and like how you would sit down and try to add to a Rails app. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. We're going to write some code real quick, and I'll kind of walk you through the tools that I have set up. So here's our screen share. We'll go this screen. I probably should minimize this. Or should I drag that to my other monitor? Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's better. Okay. All right. So there's a couple of cool ways that you can interact with a Rails application. I want to show you the Rails console first. So Rails console is invoked by being in the root directory of your application, and you just type Rails console. Now the default Rails console is pretty good as a development tool, but I've added a library called Pry to this project, and the reason I did that is because Pry is by far the greatest development tool that exists for any language, framework, or anything else. It is just the very best. And every time I sat down at another environment, I've like really craved Pry and missed it so much. It's great. So it's better than the default Rails console. It's pretty ubiquitous in the community. Like most projects that you'll use, everybody there will already be using Pry. But if not, you should add it because it's great and it just does a whole lot of things, and you can look up what those are. But it's cool. So what Pry does, what Rails console does, and what Pry like allows me to do some other cool things with is it basically loads my application with context. So right now, like I have a process that I'm attached to via Spring that has my entire application loaded, and that means that I can do anything that I wanted to do in the context of my application. So let's start by accessing some data. So I told you a little bit about ActiveRecord and what that allows us to do. ActiveRecord allows me to interact with my database without having to write SQL. So I can go article.all with some code that we saw in our controller when we were building our index method. I can type that right in my Rails console, and Pry will return some results. Now I want to talk about this because this is so cool. Pry, to help me debug, will print out the SQL that was generated by my ActiveRecord command. So when I type article.all, what ActiveRecord does for me is it connects to my database using the connection pool that's configured in the db config file, and it executes this SQL. Select articles.star from articles. This basically dumps the whole table. Now, you probably would never use this kind of a method definition in a production application, but no matter what you no matter what ActiveRecord command you type in, it'll print out the SQL that it's generating and help you to understand like what you're getting exactly. So there's a lot of built-in like syntactic sugar around ActiveRecord and like generating SQL. So let's say I wanted to find all articles where the title, and typing on a live stream is kind of nerve-wracking, where the title equals sample post. So you can see this is the SQL that gets generated. So select articles dot star from articles, where articles dot title equals this question mark is a variable, and that pulls in the argument that I passed it, which was sample post, which is pretty cool that it just like prints out the SQL to let me know exactly what it's generating. And also this right here is so much nicer to write than all of this like raw SQL, right? So there are a couple other like ActiveRecord, shortcuts. This is a really common one. Article.find will take, it takes an integer for an argument, and it automatically searches the ID column. So if I know the ID of a specific article I want to get a hold of, I can just call a .find, and ActiveRecord does this. It gives me the first article with that ID and gives it a limit, which is pretty neat. It'll always return exactly one article, as long as that's present. So ActiveRecord, Rails console, pretty cool. The other way that we interact with our Rails app is through the Rails server. Now we need to have a server going in order to access our website. So let me just show you what that looks like. I'm going to be running on localhost 3000 right now. There's no server running. Even though I have an instance of my application running, it's not actually serving HTML. So let's turn that on and tell it to serve some HTML. Rails server is the command. There's also shorthand for these, Rails C and Rails S, but Rails server and Rails console are pretty easy to remember. Now, this will just give me a little bit of output. Tell me what type of web server I'm using. Tell me what the version is. You can customize it and give it some special options. That's a pretty advanced feature. You can look at that whenever you want. But then you'll see I'm listening on this port. So I can go localhost 3000, and boom, there's my blog. Now, I probably should have like moved this down a little bit. You can see that everything that I do on my website is going to get printed out in this server pane, which is really nice if you're debugging and playing around with stuff. So if I want to click view articles, it'll show me exactly what's happening. So it's posting a get on this route, put some log stuff, tells me what controller function it rendered, what format it's responding to, shows me what layout is being loaded, shows me any ActiveRecord database queries that get executed, and it even gives me some time. So that's pretty cool that comes for free right out of the box, you guys. You can time all of your controller actions and your page rendering and see like where your slowdowns are. ActiveRecord will even print out your the time that it takes to execute your queries. Makes performance monitoring a breeze. Okay, so we've looked at console, we've looked at server. It's now time to start like really digging deep into this process right here, which is kind of the magic of Rails. Rails routing and how it ties into controller functions. This is one of the most, I would say, challenging things to pick up as a beginner coming to Rails. So break out the pens and pencils. Like, let's take some notes here. I'm going to try to break this down and make it really simple and easy for you all to understand, okay? So you remember we were in our config folder and there was that routes file, and I said we're going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to that. So this file contains more Rails magic than the whole rest of the Rails framework put together, multiplied by a million. It's just like nonstop magic, start to finish. So if you'll notice on our Rails server, we had a GET request for this /, which is just a root. And then when we went to articles, we had a GET request for articles. that map to this controller action of articles controller and this pound sign. Okay, let's explain this. So when we're dealing with routing, you'll see this kind of syntax printed out quite a bit. In fact, it's this whole line. So what it is this will tell me what file the method that's being executed lives in. So that's the first part. And I know this is articles controller. I know that's a file, and it's a controller file because of the name, but also the way that it's, has the title case definition. This pound sign means my file name is ended, and I'm now talking about a method name within that file. So inside the articles controller class, there's a method called index, and that's what's being executed. Now, your controllers can respond to different formats. You might have an index method return HTML when the request is asking for HTML, but return JSON when the request is asking for JSON, and return XML or whatever else. You can have your same controller methods respond to requests differently. And what that would basically mean is that if I came over here to localhost and I asked for articles.json, I don't have it set up, so this is probably going to throw an error or something. Oh, it's just going to time out. Oh, yeah, there's an error. Great. So I'm missing a template for that. That's fine. We're going to go back and build one here in a minute, but that's the idea, that like you can have the same route respond differently to different formats, because obviously you don't want to return a huge block of HTML if somebody's just hitting your API. So okay, the other point I was trying to make is that when I hit this articles, I am getting sent to this method within this controller, and the default respond to is HTML. But I load up my routes file, and all I see is this like resources stuff that's nested. Now, this resources is a keyword that is like some super duper Rails magic. And I've got a link that I'm going to share that's got a nice visual representation of what this looks like. Give me just a second. Oh, no. Sorry, I lost my link. I have to Google it again. Okay. All right. Here we go. Okay, so here, let me post this link in Slack. This will tell you all that you need to know about Rails Router, not Slack. Boom. This will tell you all you need to know about Rails Router. But essentially, the resources keyword will take that controller and give you like magically a bunch of routes that are all mapped to a specific verb, a RESTful verb. So in this case, if I use resources photos, this will be the path that request gets generated at, right? And if I have a GET request coming in on this path, it's going to automatically map to this controller action. Okay, so if I have a GET request on this path, it's going to automatically map to this controller action. So the word here, this this noun, this RESTful noun, photos, that could be interchanged with any controller that I have, article controller, articles controller. It could be like a users controller, it could be comments controller, whatever. But if I use resources in my my routes RB file, it's just going to automatically give me all of these routes and match to these controller actions. And that's why when I mentioned I had this articles controller up, like the words that we use here to define these functions or these methods are really important, because Rails just looks for them. And you can customize your resources if you want to like restrict. There's a good example of that syntax here. If you want to restrict and only have it do certain verbs or certain routes, But basically, there's that's the way that the resources work. So that can be like a really confusing. Where did my good? Yeah, here we go. This can be a really confusing idea for a new developer if you're like trying to troubleshoot a route and you want to see exactly what's happening, and you go and you pop open the routes folder and you see, oh man, there's only, you know, this resources thing that's not really explicit. It doesn't really tell me where, you know, where the routes are going or anything like that. But Rails has this pretty cool built-in function called rake routes, which is just something you can run. Oh, geez. The format of that pane is gross. Here, let me just pop this out into its own thing. All right, so rake routes will give me an idea of all of the routes that are available in my system. So you've got your prefix verb, you've got your URI pattern, and this just uses pattern matching, which is really cool. And then it tells me what controller action it's mapped to. So for my whole application, this will tell me all of the different ways that you know, somebody can come in and interact with my stuff, and it'll tell me like what controller actions are getting called when, which routes are getting hit with whatever verbs. This can be an extremely powerful tool to use to, you know, understand how the requests are coming into your system and what they're doing. And that's just built in for free from Rails. Now, one other thing I want to just quickly mention is this syntax of like the colon article ID. What this will give you is it'll put article ID as a variable in the params object inside these methods. So, for example, like if I have an update method, for me to update a specific article, I have to know which article I'm looking for to update it. So my put, if I send a put to my system on this route with an ID at the end, whatever comes after this slash is going to be given, is going to be put onto the params object with the key of ID. So let me show you what that looks like. So inside, back to the code, inside articles controller, there's an update method. Now I have this params ID. Params is an object. In Ruby, you can access attributes within an object by using a couple of different methods. There's the dot syntax. There's also the square bracket access syntax. But basically, params ID, and I will pass that to article find, and that will help me look up an article. But basically, what I want the takeaway to be here is that if you could put variables in your routes, get a hold of them within your controller, and then use that to target what you're trying to do. So, man, 3:30. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so we've kind of talked about that. Let's add a route and have it do something new. And then this is like one of the most basic tasks in a Rails app. You'll go to your first job, and they'll say, hey, we need a new API endpoint to perform some function, do something, and you'll need to go add it. So I was going to try to not like write a bunch of code off the top of my head and like help you find ways to do that. But we don't really have time. So I'll just kind of explain how this goes. So you've seen URLs, and where did my other pane go? All right, here it is. Let me just drop this down here. Sorry, window management stuff. So you'll see how like all of these are just nested. They start with a slash, and then just go right into articles and ID. So this is like a really nice way to build URLs for a website, because here, I'll minimize this one. You know, when I'm navigating, I just want it to be like, you know, holdyblog.com/articles should take me right to articles. But like say I was building an API and I wanted to, keep those routes separate and nested under an API, I might want to use the idea of something like a namespace to nest all my routes underneath. So you would use this if you were like setting up maybe an admin portal and you wanted access to the same like resources and controllers, and you wanted to reuse a lot of your nouns, but you wanted them to be nested in some way in a different namespace so that you can treat them differently. So an API is a good example of when and why you would do that. An admin portal is another example of like when and why you would do that. But basically, when you're like writing a custom route matcher, it's pretty simple. You start with the verb that you want to match on, and then you have the route that you want it to come in at. So articles. So if I have, a GET request on API/articles, and I think I actually need to put a slash there because if not, it won't do it automatically. So a GET that comes into API articles is going to API articles because it's namespace under API. What I want that to do is to execute a controller action. So I want that to go to, let's say, articles. So my articles controller, and that's going to be a get to articles. That's a show method, right? So articles show. Now, we talked a little bit about Rails magic a minute ago. So let's kind of push the limits and see just how magic Rails is. So what I've done is I've now added a new route to the namespace of API articles, and it's going to go to the articles controller and hit the show method. So API articles. Let's see what happens. Oh no, there's no route that matches API articles. And that is because I need to restart my server. Whoa. Live coding, folks. Did I type something in wrong? Oh, duh. See, I was going to try to copy and paste everything, and then I wouldn't make any mistakes. You guys would think I was super smart, but sometimes I haven't done this in a minute, and I forgot to add this little key of 2 that tells, match left-hand side to the right-hand side. So anyway, my server started. I'm trying to hit that route. It's not going to work because initialize constant is not the error I was expecting. But basically, I don't have a file that defines this action because the namespace of my API, I need to create a file for it. So anyway, we go into here, into controllers. I need to make a folder in here called API because I am adding that as a namespace. And Rails has like this load path thing where it looks at the file names and kind of infers the connection between objects. So in this case, I'm just going to grab a lot of this code and just copy it in here to a new file. This is going to be articles controller .rb. My articles controller is going to need to end my class. I'm going to delete this because I don't want. I want that, and then this should obviously be an index, not show. Okay, so we've done that. We've done this, and then to I'll also update my class to make sure that the namespace is included in the class definition is important so that Rails knows how to hook all of this up in my route. So this is my rake routes file. Let's run rake routes and make sure that my new API articles. Look, there's this little get route for API articles. And that is going to go to API articles index. So that's cool. So let's try to hit that route. API articles. Where's my server? Maybe I need to restart this thing. Oh, that's interesting. So it doesn't like it because it doesn't have a format that it wants to respond to. If you'll notice in, well, it doesn't do that, but it probably isn't here. Well, that's interesting. Let's just explicitly give it a format to respond to. We will render JSON articles. So I told you that Rails is magic. What this is going to do is take this active record collection, convert it to JSON, and respond with that when I hit this route. Or it's going to time out and break. Oh. Nope, it worked. Cool. So that's how easy it is to spin up a new endpoint to respond with JSON if you were going to build an API. And if I was doing this, I would actually probably be more explicit and tell it to ask for JSON specifically, because then in my controller, I could, wrap this in some safety of like, if the request comes in asking for anything other than JSON, return, some kind of 404 or something. But if it does ask for JSON, then just convert this to JSON and do that. But like, again, those are, advanced like safety things that you would do if you were building something for real. But like, we just set up a new endpoint to respond to API requests on a new custom route and format a JSON response from data coming out of our database. And it took us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines of code. And several of those lines were just the word end. And I think that that is pretty damn cool. Rails is the best. Okay. I think that that's a pretty good crash course on Rails. I have another half hour, 20 minutes, 17, 16 minutes blocked off to talk to you all. And I am ready for questions if anybody has them. If there's anything else Railsy you want to talk about, let's do it. So you can use the YouTube chat. Any Lambda School students that are on, feel free to ping me on Slack. This was asked earlier, what is the best project to prove your Rails skills? Literally anything you want. Programming is like, find a project that you're interested in or excited about and go build it. The default, like, learn Rails, like the guide, like where, I don't know, I don't have hard data on this. I don't want to say a number, but where a lot of people have gotten their first introduction to Rails was through the Hartle tutorial. Is kind of like the de facto, where most people start. So that build walks you through like a Twitter clone. Here's a link. You can access that for free. The premium version is awesome and definitely worth the money, but they have a free version up there on their site. It'll walk you through how to build a Twitter clone. Twitter, as you may know, was originally built in Rails and scaled to hundreds of millions of users. And we won't talk about what happened once they reached that scale, but yeah, build whatever you want. Build something cool. A blog is easy and a good place to start. Man, I was hoping YouTube Live would be more interactive. If nobody else has any questions, let's go ahead and wrap up. Okay. This has been a crash course in Rails. I'm Ryan Holdaway. If you found us, you probably have heard something about Lambda School. Lambda School is an online computer science academy where students can attend for free until they land a job. We teach courses in full stack web development that does not include Rails. We also teach classes in native iOS development, data science, and we are launching Android development and UX design this fall. You can learn more about that at lambdaschool.com. We also teach free introductory courses for each of those subjects that run in the evenings that still include live instruction, guided, directed code challenges from our project managers, and much of the support that our full-time students get. If you would like to get your feet wet programming, those are great places to start. I'm going to include a couple more links in the project description here. If you want additional resources to learn Rails, you can click on those links below. If you are a Lambda School student and you want additional resources about learning Rails, you can just hit me up on Slack. This has been really fun for me. Again, my name is Ryan Holdaway. I am not an instructor at Lambda School. All of our instructors are much smarter, better engineers than I am. They're also much better teachers. But at Lambda School, we care about the success of our students. And as one of our students wanted to learn Rails, I took this opportunity to teach it and thought I might as well just open that up to the whole world. So thank you, YouTube Live, for spending some time with me. This has been a blast, and I wish you all the best of luck. lambdaschool.com.